Have you formed word thoughts before? There's a hummingbird. Doesn't seem like it. I don't even have my coffee on me. This is a truly terrible day. Hi, I'm Ian, and around here I talk about books because I love to yap. And today's episode is every single book that I read in 2024. I'm going to talk about it, whether it was good, whether it was bad, whether it was mid, it doesn't matter. I'm going to talk about it. Whether or not I found the book good or bad, you might find something to add to your TBR. Or you hate all the books that I hate and you love all the books that I love, and we will have like so much to bond over. So at the risk of this being a long episode, let's just go ahead and move into it. I'm going to talk about these books in the order that I read them over the course of 2024. And first up is one of my absolute favorites of the year. It Changed My Life, What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma by Stephanie Fu. This literally changed my life. I read it over the course of a year because it was that intense and it requires that much self-reflection. If you are someone who suffered from trauma in childhood, especially neglectful or manipulative guardians or authority figures in your life, and you have an issue trusting people even as an adult, this might be the book that you need. All of the trigger warnings, be sure to look it up. After that, I finished A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Toews. I don't know how to pronounce that, honestly. And this is a coming of age story about, I think, a Mennonite girl, like in her adolescence, and kind of in the wake of her mother leaving her. I read this for a book club that I was in at the time, and I thought it was okay, but I knew some people that did have religious trauma, and this really resonated with them. So if that's something that you're interested in, or you're looking for validation as someone with a similar experience, this might be for you. Then I finished What Belongs to You by Garth Greenwell. I finished this on the plane to New Zealand, and I started this back in like 2022 when I was on a beach in Mexico. I talk about it in my top 10 of 2024, so I would just go over there and watch that if I were you. I'll link it below. This book is really for the gay men. I think gay men will get a lot out of this and will identify with a lot of this. It's just messy. The main character is very messy, but you also get a deep dive into his past, like his adolescence and growing up gay in like the Deep South, and that adds to a lot of the complexities of this character. After that, I finished A Shining by John Fosse. This actually was a short story that I think maybe won the Pulitzer. I think it was a Pulitzer. I'm sure there's a goddamn sticker on whatever I'm putting up here. It's basically about a man who is driving into the night, and he comes to the end of a road and decides to get out of the car and wander into the forest. It is very surreal. I really enjoyed it, but I don't think that it was particularly groundbreaking. So, but if you're looking for a quick read, it's like 112 pages. Get closer to your goals a little faster, maybe. Then I read a poetry book, this time while I was in New Zealand. It's called Bright Fear by Mary Jean Chan. I loved this book. I love the cover. Like, there's something about this color combo that just sings to me. This has to deal a lot with hate towards Asian Americans, especially before, during, and after pandemic. And there's also a level of generational trauma that the author talks about, as well as being queer. It's a really interesting read and a great perspective to get familiar with. I did shortly after that finish Stay True by Hua Xu. I'd actually been reading this memoir written by this photographer Hua Xu for like 6 months or something. So it was like time to like wrap it up. Let's finish it. This won the Pulitzer in 2023, and it is about the author's time in mid-90s Berkeley, California as a college student, and the best friend that he made, like an unlikely pairing, and tragically his best friend was murdered in a carjacking incident. And even though it's been 20 plus years, it seems like the author is still grappling with like the loss of that friendship and trying to not lose those memories like at the same time. I really liked this. It's really interesting, but this isn't flourishy. Big emotions aren't really coming up in this memoir, and that's what I thought was interesting about it. You're gonna get some amazing world building around like 90s subculture and Asian American culture, and this is very much a vibe, but it's also a really fascinating peek inside the mind of someone who's just, you know, like grieving in a very particular way. No one was awake, and then I started recording and everyone was like, oh my god, it's time to get up. How about we start hammering like anything? Let's just demolish it. Then I read Deep Wheel or Katia, which is a sci-fi book written in verse. It's very surreal, it's queer, and it's written kind of in two parts. Literally every page is written in two parts. You have the top half and the bottom half, and the top half is written in Orkney dialect, and then the bottom half is written in regular English. It's wild. It's very, very different, and I really liked how bold it was. It is fascinating to see like how You know what? It's not fascinating. I'm a language nerd. If you're a language nerd, check this out, but it's not going to be fascinating to most people. Moving on. Then I read another poetry book, Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit by Jen Campbell, who is a booktuber on here, and this is about the trauma that people with disabilities experience from childhood through to adulthood, and specifically from Jen Campbell's personal experience. It's immensely powerful. Then I read The Slob by Erin Beauregard, which is an extreme horror about a woman who is kidnapped while going door-to-door selling vacuums. I hated this a lot. I hated it because it was, not only was it like, oh my god, how was this person thinking up these things? This is incredibly disturbing. Like, yeah, that's definitely a part of it, but then the other part of it is that a lot of the violence against the character is unique to her gender as a woman. This feels very particular in like an icky way. And then it ends up being a message on like capitalism. No, buddy. No, that fell flat real fast. Then I read Something Will Happen, You'll See by Christos Economou. I think it was translated from the Greek by Karen Emmerich. Talked about it a lot. That's how I know that. That's kind of weird. But the only reason I've talked about it a lot was because I really didn't like it. I went through like a string of great stuff and then a string of like stuff that I hated. And this was part of that. I read this for like an Around the World challenge. This is because it's from Greece and it's a very unique perspective. Like, these stories kind of take place around the Great Recession that happened in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I thought it was really fascinating, really interesting time period, but these stories were not fascinating or interesting. They were really boring. I don't remember any of them. I just would not pick it up if I were you. Then I read Organ Meats by K. Ming Chong, and this was so weird. It is about two young girls and their childhood friendship and the imaginary worlds that they create, and somehow those worlds kind of blend into reality, especially like as they age and grow up. It's all over the place. It's kind of hard to understand because it's very surreal. I would walk around my apartment just reading this out loud because the mouthfeel of the syntax, the vocabulary, the voice of this author was so magical. If you're into weird fiction, and especially feminist weird fiction that is not plot driven but purely vibes, this is a great book for that. Then I finished The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, which I had started like 2 years before and I just could not get into it. So this is a queer historical YA sort of fantasy-ish about a bisexual, like, teenage boy who's getting ready to travel Europe, as was common back in the 1800s. It's about his love for his best friend, and he's not really willing to admit that he loves his best friend, and then he finds out that his best friend has a terminal illness. They go in search of a panacea, which is something that, like, cures all ailments. But I did particularly enjoy the internal dialogue that the main character has about his feelings for his bestie. I have tried to read an HP book a year for the past couple years. I might do that again. I'm not going to talk about it though. I don't give airtime to TERFs. But I will say that that book is the worst book in the series. Then I read Black Moses by Alain Mambako. This is historical fiction, sort of Oliver Twist retelling taking place in the Congo. And the author is Congolese. If I'm being frank, I thought this was very dry. It was well written, but I did not find it interesting. Then I read Fake Dates and Mooncakes by Cher Lee. This is a queer rom-com, fake dates and mooncakes, fake dating trope. This is YA, so it's two, I think, high school seniors. One of them works for his aunt in their Chinese restaurant in New York, and he falls for a rich dude who eventually invites him to a wedding to be his fake date. And, you know, it's tropey. It's exactly what you expected it to be, and it was fun. That's all I have to say. But then I got to my favorite book of the year, and that was In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. 5-star read for me. It's about two British boarding school boys who are kind of in love, but it's obviously way more complicated than that. They end up enlisting to be in the British Army during World War I and both head on over to the trenches. Sometimes it's so gruesome and gory, and then other times it is beautifully, lyrically poetic, and there is a lot of poetry in this too. It's not very spicy. There are a few spicy scenes for those of you that care. It's not hot and heavy. It's insane to think that this is a debut. Then I listened to the audiobook for The Age of Magical Overthinking by Amanda Montell. I have not read any of her other stuff. People have consistently said that this is her worst that she's ever written. I don't know about that, but I can believe it because this book is straddling the line between almost like a dating life memoir and social commentary. I heard a lot of people describe this as a bit of a money grab, and I can see that. Then I read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff. This is an epistolary memoir. The author went in search of rare books that she could not find in America and instead requested that these books be sent to her by a small bookstore in London on whose address is 84 Charing Cross Road. This is very sweet and simple. I think that the author maybe was a heavy drinker and a heavy smoker. Like, you get that kind of vibe. She also wrote for like television, you find out, like through these letters between the people at the bookstore and the author. It was fun. It was great. It was very sweet. I followed that up with The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. Cannot remember if this is translated. I think it's translated. This is about a widow who most people in her town are afraid of because they all believe that she murdered her husband and was never charged for it and basically got away with it. This book kind of incorporates that ostracized mentality with the really complex caste system that exists in India and how both of those things are a disadvantage to all of the women. The central premise behind this is that one woman decides that her abusive husband, like, has to go. Gotta kill him. And so in order to get help, she goes to the main character to do so because she successfully killed her husband and didn't get caught for it. There is a mystery element to this a little bit as well. This is definitely like feminist vibes. The humor in this, it's hilarious. It's dark, but it's hilarious. After that, I read The Troop by Nick Cutter and I hated it. It's about a scoutmaster who takes, I think it's 5 boys to a remote island off the Canadian coast where they're supposed to spend the weekend surviving or something. And then they come across a guy infected with a parasite that makes you do crazy things. And I think this book is supposed to be commenting on masculinity. I don't think it does so effectively. You know, I will just be honest and I will say I've seen a lot of straight men who really like this book. After that, I finished Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. That's actually my first Taylor Jenkins Reid, so you can imagine that I'm really excited to be reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo this year. This is about the world's like best tennis player who is retired and finds herself coming out of retirement because her record has been stolen by a brand new younger player. And this is so propulsive, it's so fast-paced. I love the writing about the matches and stuff like that. I've heard criticism that this is just so unrealistic, and I'm like, it is fiction. I guess if you're a tennis player or just an athlete in general, like maybe don't read this. I absolutely loved it. There's also some criticism about a white woman writing a femme POC character. That's important to note. We should be talking about that. I loved this character. I loved her relationship with her father, and I loved her struggles with romance, especially being so dedicated to her career. I only read 1 book in June and 1 book in July. The first book I read in June was Taproot. It was a graphic memoir. It's by Keezy Young. Full color pages. It is about a romance between a ghost and a gardener. It is queer. It is beautiful. It's also sometimes like really like scary, a little nerve-wracking. I really enjoyed this. It was really good. And in July, I read Instructions for Traveling West, Poems by Joy Sullivan. I find this to be an extremely digestible collection of poems. The author grew up a little bit, I think in the Congo. So she's had a really interesting life, and she writes a little bit about that, writes a little bit about her romance life, a whole collection of things. But one thing that I really love about this is how embodied she gets and how the inner world and the outer world, especially nature, are inextricable, and how, you know, the metaphors and the analogies and all of the mechanics of her poems tie those two things together, and that's a kind of poetry that I really, really like. Then I read Pity by Andrew McMillan. It's about 192 pages, and this one's kind of hard to explain, but especially to Americans, because there is a play on words here. Coal mining towns in the UK, I think, are referred to as pitties or like pit towns or something like that. Even the title is a play on words. This centers around a young gay man who is also a drag queen, and from there it kind of branches out into like talks about his dad and his uncle and his boyfriend and how all of them are kind of grappling with different ways of being masculine. This is definitely like an elevated piece of fiction that I really, really liked. But just because it's short doesn't mean that it was like a super easy read. Then I read Boy Parts, one of my favorites of the year, by Eliza Clark. This is definitely like post-Tumblr era sort of literature, but there is a time and a place for it, and I read it during that time and at that place. This is about a female photographer, young, probably I think she's in her like late 20s, totally unhinged. The main character is absolutely an anti-hero, and you don't necessarily root for her, but you also cannot turn away as the train is about to wreck. Brings up questions about art, about the ethics of creating it, about consumption of that art, regardless of the ethics. I read Goddess of Filth by V. Castro after that. Easily one of the worst books that I read this year. I absolutely hated it. The author seems cool, but I was not happy. It's a really short book, has to do with female possession. What I specifically remember is reading every paragraph and being like, why are we talking about 4 different things? It was like there was no understanding of how to create an actual paragraph. Then I listened to Lavender House House by Lev A.C. Rosen on audiobook. I loved this audiobook. I am really excited to delve into this series more. So far, 3 books are out. I think a 4th is coming out in 2025. Like, I am loving this. This is a queer historical mystery. It takes place in the 1950s. The main character is this sort of Marlowe-type detective who was ousted from the police force for being gay. He's hired by a very wealthy perfume maker who lives out on this estate just outside of San Francisco, where a group of queers basically live, and he has to solve the mystery of someone who was allegedly murdered. Very stereotypical noir voice and straight up a whodunit in the style of Agatha Christie. It's just queer. Like, it's just, I had a blast with this. I'm really excited to continue following Evander Mills, I think is the name of the character. Like, what a great fucking name too. I loved this. Check it out if you like mysteries, or even if you don't. I'm actually not a big mystery fan. I loved it. I read The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise by Colleen Oakley. This was a cute intergenerational friendship. A young woman who's down and out, down on her luck because she injured her leg and had to leave college as an athlete. Doesn't know what to do with her life, etc. Super depressed, gets tasked with taking care of an older woman who has a lot of secrets from her past and is pretty spitfire. Like, she's someone you don't want to mess around with. This becomes like an odd couple road trip story with some mystery thrown in there, got some mob stories. There's a really adorable fucking twist. It's a lot of fun. It's really cute. Then I finished Blackouts by Justin Torres. This is definitely on the weirder side of fiction. It's about a young queer man who is at the deathbed of one of his former lovers. It's intellectual. They're telling each other stories. They're talking about this historical figure who actually existed. And all throughout, there's like this book about sexuality that is heavily redacted that this young man is reading and trying to understand at the same time. This is all vibes, no plot. There are notations in this, there are photographs in this, and the book itself is actually printed in brown ink. So it's really interesting. You have to be in an erudite headspace to start this and to finish it. And that's not to say that I was smart enough to be reading it. Then one of my favorites of the year, second favorite of the year, Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. This is about a young Iranian-American man who immigrated with his father as a child to the US after the death of his mother in a tragic plane accident where the US shot down an Iranian plane. That's based on real facts. The young man is kind of obsessed with this idea of martyrdom as part of an artistic project that he's looking into. There are some surrealist, magical realism elements to this, so beware if that is not your style. This is like new American literature that needs to be studied. I then read Mammoth by Eva Baltazar, my first time reading Eva Baltazar, Catalan author. I can't remember who this is translated by, but this is about a lesbian who decides to get pregnant and fails to do so, so she decides to go live in the woods, in the mountains, all by herself. She's such a weird character. Weird things happen to her. It's a really short book, but this is pure literary fiction. It takes place contemporary. There are no magical elements. There's a lot of interacting with animals and gruff farmers, and there's sort of a survivalist element because she's living in a farmhouse like by herself in the middle of nowhere. I then finished Your Driver Is Waiting by Priya Guns. This was billed as female Taxi Driver. And if you've seen Taxi Driver starring Robert De Niro, directed by Martin Scorsese, this book, up until a certain point, is shot by shot very similar to Taxi Driver. It brings in a lot of commentary on white privilege and the immigrant experience, especially child of immigrants. These chapters are super short. I think this book has like 99 chapters. Then I read Cleanness by Garth Greenwell. I finished Your Driver Is Waiting and Cleanness by Garth Greenwell on a train ride. I specifically took a train, a small town in Oregon, and then I was there for like an hour. I hung out at a bookshop, and then I hopped back on the train back to where I live, and I finished 2 books while on that train ride. Cleanness features the same character as What Belongs to You. However, this is a bit more of a vignette style. It's a bit longer of a book. It is a really spicy book. It was really nice to revisit this character and also to see this character kind of outside the context of his like obsession in What Belongs to You. This was really good. I read Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. This is one of those books where it's just like, it's just not made for me. This takes place in Reno, Nevada during a young women's boxing tournament. And so each chapter is a different match. During each match, we're put inside the heads of each of the boxers. It's too much information about characters to ever really feel connected to them. I think there are some people who would really like this. I read The Last House on Needless Street with my It's Only a Book Club, where we read one horror novel a month. You can join us over on Fable. We read this. This was full of twists. I have thoughts about this. I just think that there's a lot to talk about here. There's a man who lives alone with his cat, and his cat is like a character that like is very religious, like worships God reads the Bible. This man gets a new neighbor who's kind of obsessed with him and what he's doing, and her younger sister had disappeared and gone missing, like tragically, back when she was like a teenager. There is a mental health element to this that I just wish that there had been maybe a little bit more commentary on that in the book itself. I read My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. It's really hard for me to say. This is about a woman who suspects her sister is a sociopath and a serial killer, and she really questions where her loyalties lie, and that is the whole book. I thought this was really interesting. I couldn't really tell if this was a character study or if this was supposed to be plot driven, and I feel like that is what interrupted the pacing, and it kind of took me longer to read than I thought it would. Then I read the longest book that I read this year, The Rise and Fall by Ancient Egypt by Toby Wilkinson, who is a queer author. That's cool. This was a vast and complete history of ancient Egypt. If that interests you, absolutely check this out. It was a little bit too much information for me. I read Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. So this is half historical fiction, half contemporary fiction, half prequel, half sequel to There. The sequel portion to Tommy Orange I did find really interesting, but I didn't find it that interesting compared to what was going on historically when we're talking about how the characters from There have come to be through their lineage and through their history, and especially through how white people treated natives. But I think I would have enjoyed this more if the two hadn't been together. Then I read Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and I loved this. It's this neurodivergent woman who gets a job at a convenience store to kind of appease her family and just loves it. She tries to date again to appease her family, and it's just like not really into it. If you are neurodivergent, you've ever had to mask around neurotypical people, you will totally identify with this character. And this is also super short. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was 3 hours and 22 minutes. So I promise, you got this. And this is a hoot of a character. I loved it. Then I read Bluff Poems by Denez Smith. Denez Smith is very well known for Don't Call Us Dead and Homie, two previous poetry collections. This poetry collection is insanely powerful. I would say it's not as potent as his previous work, but it's still very good. And this has a lot to do with sort of naming how we thought certain politicians would fix everything, and then they just didn't, because white privilege and systemic racism is much more powerful. Then I finished James, a novel by Percival Everett, which won the National Book Award this year. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It was all over the place in 2024, and rightfully so. It is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, but told from the perspective of Jim, or James. He's such a great character. This book still has the spirit of like American adventure, except it is not this whitewashed version of it. Then I read Didn't Nobody Give a Shit What Happened to Carlotta by James Hannaham. This is told in a stream of consciousness style, like in the vernacular without quotation marks, and it can be kind of hard to understand, but luckily the audiobook is really, really good. This takes place over the course of a day, and it's about Carlotta, who transitioned in prison. She was falsely convicted for being involved in a fatal robbery. She's finally given parole after like 20 years and has to adapt to a whole new New York City. Her family is seeing her transition for the first time. Her son is seeing her like for the first time in decades. Like, it's a really intense experience, and somehow there is so much humor in this, and this story really does inspire a lot of empathy and understanding for like how hard it is to try to re-enter society, especially after being in a like survival mode in prison for years. Then I read House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias. This is about a group of friends who decide to avenge the murder of a family member and a friend, and it's told in Puerto Rico during the onslaught of a hurricane, and it involves a lot of Puerto Rican politics. This is sort of new adult, like there's a coming of age element to this, but they're all adults already, so I think you would kind of call that new adult. This is horror. There's some fantasy elements in here. I really loved the kind of Taino mythology that was incorporated in this. That was really new and interesting to me. I did feel that a lot of the book was telling me how to feel about these characters rather than simply just getting me invested in them. For that reason, it wasn't my absolute favorite. Then I read Stolen Tongues by Felix Blackwell, and that was one of the scariest books I've ever read in my entire life. There was one night where I read it for 3 hours. I finished it 3 hours straight, and I was damp because I had been sweating, so I felt like sick. This isn't like a masterpiece, but the author really understands the rhythm of what is needed to like give you chills and actually terrify you. I freaking loved this. For the History Sickos book club, I read Kill Anything That Moves by Nick Turse. This is an account of all the atrocities that Americans committed against the Vietnamese, both North and South, during the Vietnam War. It's a really important piece to have all of this stuff kind of memorialized in a record. However, there is no real central conceit or like argument to this, and because of that, it really just becomes like a series of like, hey, here's a list of all the terrible things that happened. I read Somewhere Beyond the Sea by T.J. Klune. This was the sequel to The House in the Cerulean Sea, and we come back to the characters, but this time we're more focused on Arthur Parnassus and how he came to be the Phoenix, and also learning to struggle with the idea that if you are a monster, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad to be a monster. I don't think it's as good as the first book. I do think it's under-edited. It's still sweet. I love these characters enough to have read all like 400 some pages of this in a very short amount of time. I loved it. I read Medusa of the Roses by Naveed Sanaki. This kind of reminded me of Martyr in that an Iranian American wrote it, yes, but there are elements of martyrdom that they actually talk about in this book as well. This is a bit of a noir. I didn't really like it very much. It's also very spicy and not in a sexy way. But it's about these childhood friends that have grown up. One is married to a woman, one is single, plans to transition. They're lovers, they're having an affair. They talk about leaving the country so they can go be openly gay together somewhere else or whatever. It has a very typical kind of like, like femme fatale sort of, even though this is probably more like femme trope in here. I don't know, it was a bit odd for me. Then I read Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach. I think literally this was on Creepypasta on Reddit. I thought that this was kind of boring. It's about this man who is taking care of his ailing and elderly mother. He's trying to piece together this mystery from his childhood. And although there are some creepy parts to this, a lot of people have said like this is one of the scariest books ever of all time. I did not feel that way. I was pretty bored. I also did not like the voice of the author. At times it felt like it was like his scientific study. I don't know how else to describe it. It just felt very, very dry at times, which is not what I want to be reading if I'm trying to be scared. Beautyland by Marie, I always screw this up. Beautyland by Marie Helene Bertino. This is about a young girl who is raised by a mother on Earth. She reports back to her home planet all of the observations that she makes about humanity. This was a really, really sweet book and a really great neurodiverse character. I read The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This is a historical fiction horror book based on true accounts of a young boy who, after kicking a white boy in the shins, is sentenced to this reform school, quote unquote. You know that there's child labor in there. You know that there's other shit in there too, because there are ghosts in there as well. The writing in this is so good. The characterization in this is so good. Emotions that these characters feel are truly palpable. And I love how vulnerable this little boy is. And the choice to not harden him. Such a bold choice. And it hits. It's so good. Then I read Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Basterrica. This is about a world in which eating animal meat will give you a virus that will kill you, so the world decides instead of going vegan, they will just harvest human meat. This is told from the perspective of a man who is kind of a head honcho at one of the meatpacking plants, and he has made some illegal choices that definitely keep you in question, like where's this gonna go, like what's gonna happen here. It was interesting enough to keep me invested. I thought the translation was not that good. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. Loved that I read this alongside Tender is the Flesh. I actually really liked that combo. So this is we don't even know if this is like takes place on Earth, right? There's so little information about this book, but it is told from the perspective of a young woman who is in a cage in the ground with a bunch of other women who are much older than her. None of them knows how they got there, why they're there, or anything else about the world outside of that cage. This is another neurodivergent coded female character, which I love. I loved it. I then read A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, another really short book. This is the second book in the Monk and Robot duology. It's the sequel to A Psalm for the Wild Built. We followed Dex, the non-binary T-Monk, and Moscap, the robot, as they travel from the middle of nowhere back to society so that Moscap can accomplish its goal of truly understanding what humans need. I love these characters. There's some really beautiful interactions between them and other characters, and this is very, very low stakes sci-fi, and this replenished my soul in the month of November. I read Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, queer Harry Potter with vampires. This is a YA novel. I loved the central romance, and I'm looking forward to reading more books in this series. I read the prequel to Legends and Lattes called Bookshops and Bondas by Travis Baldree. I thought that this was too confined by the low stakes, high fantasy trope. I thought that there was a good story buried in here and that Travis Baldree just was not able to let it out. I read Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Obviously that book starts in 2024, ends it's non-linear in 2027, and it just feels too close to home. I then read The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. This is about a 14-year-old boy who inherits a bookstore from his recently deceased grandfather. Cat comes out of the bookshelves one night before he's about to close and says, "Hey, I need your help going to other dimensions to save mistreated books." So there's sort of 4 parables in here, and each one poses a different challenge about books. This is very anti-capitalist, but it's also not like, it's not full-throated in that way, but it definitely is poking fun at places like Amazon that can actually be really shitty for book culture. I read Sociopath, a memoir by Patrick Gagney. This is a memoir written by an actual sociopath who is a therapist today. They have a really interesting story because it's far more tame than you'd think it would be. And it is still like really enlightening. And how are people with personality disorders able to develop feelings of sympathy and empathy when they're not afforded those in the first place? It's really interesting. Apparently on a sociopath bender, because I also read A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. This is about a food critic who is a cannibalist serial killer. This book starts off really strong. The writing is very lush and witty. It doesn't evolve along with the story, so the tone is just kind of the same throughout. It's like a really rich dessert. It's not as interesting as you'd think it would be. I read More Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, which is the sequel to Days at the Morisaki Bookshop. I thought the first one was okay. It was pretty low stakes, slow life, you know, very simple. And this book I thought was just downright boring. There were a focus on characters that I just didn't really care about. I wanted to know more about the main character, and nothing really happens in it. Like, I don't know. If you want a book about nothing, like, this might hit. I then read Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka. This is a story told from, I think it's 4 different perspectives. One of the perspectives is serial killer, again, on death row before, you know, and then a non-linear multi-perspective, like branching out among the women in his life. So I think it's a detective and maybe his mother and maybe someone's sister. I really can't remember. I did not find this to be as interesting as I thought it would be, and I'm a little perplexed as to why this is like straight up anti-Bechdel. I listened to the audiobook Drowning by TJ Newman, which is narrated by Steven Weber, and there was a female narrator, but I can't remember her name. Sorry, hopefully it's up here. And I freaking loved this. I listened to it in a day. I was hungover and laying in bed, and I was like, I am not doing anything else today. It was so propulsive, literally unputdownable. I freaking loved this. It was so much fun. I then read Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which won the Booker Prize this year. This is a sweeping, contemporary, no new science sci-fi novel told from the perspective of astronauts orbiting Earth in a space station. This reminded me of Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle in ways that I just was like, I'm not getting any quality time with these characters. I'm being told a lot about how they are, who they are, or will be. That didn't hit. What did hit was definitely the descriptions of seeing Earth from space. I then read Confessions by Kanae Minato. I really loved this. This is told in 3 parts, and it's about a teacher whose young daughter is murdered by 2 of her students. The first part starts with the teacher basically just being like, I know who did it. She's in front of the classroom. It's her last day. She's getting ready to retire because she just can't like handle it anymore. And she's like, I know who did it. Get ready. It's coming back to you. And the next 2 parts are from each of the students that were involved, how they came to like meet and sort of plan this out. But don't worry, it is a revenge story, because at the very end, you're wondering like, where's this gonna go? Where's this gonna go? And on the very last page, the mic fucking drops. Here's the thing. If you're not a patient person, and if you're not a character-driven reader, this will not work for you, because you really do have to read into the last page. I then read Knife: Meditations After an Attempted Murder by Salman Rushdie. I actually listened to this on audiobook. Salman Rushdie did the narration for this. This is the memoir about his stabbing. In 2022, he was on a panel and he was talking about like the need to protect authors and their voices and keep them safe. And then a man rushed up on stage and stabbed him ruthlessly. It was terrible. And so the memoir is about him healing from that, and also he has like these imaginary conversations wanting to face his like attacker. And it's a really interesting peek inside this man's brain, and this author is really fascinating. If you don't know a lot about him, go check out more. I read Say Nothing, a true story of murder and mayhem in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a non-fiction narrative, historical, true crime about the troubles in Northern Ireland, the conflict between the IRA and Unionists. This centers around specifically the disappearance of a woman who was the mother of 10 children. You get to know a bunch of key players on either side, mostly on the IRA side, and it was really fascinating. It was really interesting. However, I was kind of surprised that it wasn't more on the narrative side of things. It read more textbook than I thought it would, and that was probably the most disappointing part. I then read Beartown by Frederick Bachman, which was like one of the best ways to like end the year was reading this. This is about a town who is relying on their hockey team, who's about to go to national semi-finals. If they win the whole thing, they basically get, you know, like the town is going to be on the map again. People are going to want to send their kids there to learn hockey, and then the town's going to grow, and then tourism can become a thing. You know, like it's just like they're so excited for this hockey team to win, but there's an incident halfway through the book that involves one of the star hockey players on the team, and that incident shatters the town. Totally tears the town apart and changes the course of Beartown, presumably forever. This is the first book of 3. And I'm so excited to get to the second one. This was like a 4.5-star read for me. I loved this. Then I read a few shorter books, Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. It's 136 pages, queer, fantasy, historical fiction. This is about a woman who is tasked with tracking down the White City vampire in like post-war 1940s Chicago. There are magical elements in this, and she's doing it so that she does not have to spend an eternity in hell after selling her soul to save her brother. So that way she can spend the rest of her life with her girlfriend. This was pretty fast. It was very noir style. I like a lot of noir this year. Apparently I'm into noir. My only gripe is that this was actually too short. Like, these characters had really interesting backgrounds, and I really would have loved more. I then read Secret Santa by Andrew Schaffer. This is a horror novel about a woman who kind of weasels her way into becoming the newest editor at a prestigious publishing firm in New York City. But what she walks into is a pretty hostile work environment. And then there's a Secret Santa gift exchange that goes horribly wrong. This involves cults and cursed dolls and a lot of other 1980s horror elements, lots of mention of Stephen King. I think this book is actually pretty bland. Given everything that I've just told you, you think it would be far more interesting, and it was literally just okay. I finished off the year with reading The Employees by Olga Ravin. Not a great way to end the year. This is a super short, like 125-page sci-fi novel about a group of humans and humanoids that discover a planet. They call it New Discovery. They find these objects on this planet, and they're strangely obsessed with them. And so the whole book is this sort of investigation into why and how these people have become obsessed with these objects. So each sort of chapter is like a statement by a different anonymous person. Hear what I'm saying? Anonymous person. I'm a character-driven reader. Like, I was not into this. And that is every single book I have read in 2024. Hopefully you got some suggestions out of this. In the meantime, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe so we can keep chatting about books. As always, have a wonderful day, happy reading, and I will see you next time.